I had some good experiences while in the military in Hawaii. There was one time the astronauts that went to the moon came back and landed not too far from our island, and the Navy picked them up and brought them to our Air Force base. They had them quarantined in this trailer because they didn't know they'd been to the moon and they didn't know what diseases they might have picked up on the moon and brought back to the earth. So they quarantined them. And actually, whenever they left Hawaii, they flew in a plane back to Houston, Texas. And this plane and trailer and all was right across the street from where I slept. So I just walked across the street and I got to see them, waved at them. And President Nixon, he was there, and he made a little speech. And the next day, President Nixon left, and I went over to see him leave. And I got his picture, and whenever I took his picture, he said, there's more cameras out here this morning than there are people. But that's all there was to that. But I figured I had a choice whether to shake his hand or take his picture, because I only had just a few seconds to do what I was going to do. So I thought that, well, if I take his picture, I'll have that for the rest of my life. If I shake his hand, nobody will believe me.
So, in this story that my grandfather tells me about when he was serving in Hawaii and he met the president and met the astronauts that went on the moon, he talks about how they were living in a trailer because they were quarantined since we didn't know what the moon brought back to the world. So this shows counterculture because our society was changing with new technology, that we were able to go to the moon, and we didn't know how this would affect us on Earth. So it just adds change to the culture that we previously had.
He was also in the military. He was in the Army. He was in Hawaii in December of 1941. And he was fixing to go out and play baseball. It was on a Sunday morning. And here come a bunch of Japanese planes over his head. And he was also in Hawaii. And these Japanese planes were about probably 5 minutes from bombing Pearl Harbor. So that affected his life a great deal. That started World War II when they bombed Pearl Harbor, and he stayed in to the end of the war. He was in artillery, which shot guns at the enemy. But his life changed in that one day because he was a member of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Club, which they met every year. People from all over the United States corresponded all the time. But that was a pretty big experience for him. And whenever he come back out of the service, he worked at different jobs, but he worked most of his life with the railroad in Waycross. And
So, this story about my great grandfather surviving Pearl Harbor shows the narrative heroic quest structure. There's 3 parts to this structure, which is departure, transformation, and return. The departure for my great-grandfather would be going into the Army, and his transformation would be when Pearl Harbor got attacked, and he fought in World War II. And his return would be when he left the Army, as he says, a new man, and that really changed his life. And he was very open about that when he was alive, and he attended survivor meetings up until the day he died, traveling around the country, meeting with his fellow survivors. This is a quote that my great grandfather would say every year on the anniversary. He would say that on his birthday, September 25th, 1941, he became 21, but it wasn't until December 7th, 1941, that he became a man. And my great grandfather was very changed after Pearl Harbor. He became more religious, and he would do interviews for the newspaper, for different newspapers all around the country, talking about his experience at Pearl Harbor and how much that affected his life.
Well, when I was small, we lived almost in the city, but it was hard for us to keep pets because when we'd have a dog, he'd always get out the road, get run over, and Mom always told the story later on. So Jack was in the bathtub, and I went in and told him that Buster got run over, and he said, "Well, I told him he needed to stay out of the road." So she thought I was going to really be crying and all that, but that's what I said. She always remembered me saying that.
So, this story, my grandfather talks about when my great grandmother told him that their dog had gotten ran over. And instead of immediately being upset that he had just lost his pet, my grandfather responds with, "Well, I told him to stay out of the road." Now, I'm not quite sure if my grandfather was serious about that or if he was just trying to lighten the mood, but my great grandmother found it hilarious. And he even says that she talked about this for almost the rest of her life, recalling when my grandfather said that. So I think this relates to a disaster joke, because a disaster joke is a joke dealing with an unspeakable situation or dealing with our fears and anxieties. And a dead dog is not the most pleasant thing to make a joke about. And even though my grandfather didn't use a punchline or a pun, my great grandmother found humor out of it and considered him just making a joke out of the situation.
He was blind, and one of the songs that he had sung, and one of his favorite songs was whenever he died and went to heaven, that he would be able to see. And that was one of the songs he sung at his own funeral.
So he pre-recorded the songs?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And they played them over the speakers at the church. That was different.
Yeah.
This story that my grandfather tells me about his father talks about how my great grandfather was a very talented musician, and he played the guitar and sang in church up until his death. And even though he was completely blind towards the end of his life, he still was playing music all the time. Music was such a special part of his life that he pre-recorded folk songs to be played at his funeral. One of these songs was a Christian folk song about how he would gain his vision back when he returned to heaven. My family still has these recordings and listens to them regularly, even though it's been almost 20 years since my great grandfather passed away. And this just shows how important folk songs are to my family, especially Christian folk songs, because my family is very religious, and just how much of an impact music made on my great grandfather, that he left his mark after he passed away with music.
Yeah.
Can you tell me some more about some quilts that she made?
Well, one that it went to the state fair. It won some awards at a local fair in Waycross, and then she put it in the state fair, and it won some awards. But it was in 1976. It was a bicentennial quilt, and she had a patch on the quilt representing each state of the United States, and that was an original. She designed it, made it herself.
And she won awards with it?
Yes.
That's cool.
In this story, my grandfather recalls his mother being a very talented quilt maker, and she was making quilts up until she passed away. I remember receiving many quilts from her for me and my brother right before she passed away. And this is a direct relation to folk art, which is something made decorative and very close attention to detail. So in this specific story, he talks about her making a quilt with all the 50 states on it, and each state had things that they are most well known for, such as Georgia having a peach and state flower. She won awards for this, and she used this quilt to show American culture and what each state is known for itself.